You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 486 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm covering how Israel used fake documents to move the U.S. closer towards war with Iran. I have updates on Russiagate and Michael Flynn, and I'm going to talk about U.S. and Russian nuclear policy. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to somebody. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where I am the news editor and write the daily news roundup. Both the roundup and the show can be found on the homepage libertarianinstitute.org. If you're a new listener to the show, make sure you subscribe to it somewhere. I put out 3 shows a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, talking about current events going on with the U.S. empire. Unless if you want to help the show financially, look at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus and thinking about donating. So the first story I have today is part of my ongoing coverage of the coronavirus quarantine here in the U.S. And while this isn't strictly foreign policy news, I think there's enough impact on especially the First Amendment, freedom of speech and assembly, that we have to just be so vigilant of the rights the government is taking here. And that's not to say that you shouldn't also be mindful of the coronavirus and take it seriously and understand what it is and what precautions you need to take to keep you, your family, those around you safe. But this story I have today is pretty disturbing. It's from Kentucky, where a new family was moving to Kentucky. The mother moved first and I guess got an ID, and then the father moved whenever his business in New York was done. So parents have IDs from separate states. As they move to a new state, they need to set up a bank account. One of the complicated things going on right now is you have all these regulations and rules that are written that everybody has to follow, or they're violating federal laws and stuff like that. So one of those rules is that if you're opening a joint bank account, both parties have to be present. In most circumstances, this kind of made sense. It probably prevents a lot of fraud, and there's a lot of reason to think this regulation made sense. However, if you're now in a situation where you have several young children and both parents have to go to the bank to open a bank account, and babysitting is probably not really social distancing, and how many additional people are you exposing your child to? And so hiring a babysitter, may not have been fiscally possible, but even then it really isn't practicing good social distancing either. And so I'm sure these parents put a lot of thought into, well, how can we possibly open this bank account with both parents being in the bank and having, I think, a total of 7 children and 5 young children. What they decide is that all their children will come to the bank with them. The 2 oldest will stay in the cars. They feel that they're capable of being in the car safely, while the youngest 5 will come in and then, stay on the opposite side of the bank from the employees with one parent, and then the parents would flip, and that this would be, the seemingly way to do it. Now, maybe you disagree and you say they should have hired a babysitter or found another way to do this. Maybe they should have waited to open the bank account, but you don't know their particular situation, and it doesn't seem like this is an unreasonable action to take. Now, one of the bank tellers apparently was named Karen and decided to call the police and report a child abuse situation where parents weren't appropriately social distancing, reported bruising on the children, and that the children were with a man who wasn't their father. And so it pretty clearly was somebody at the bank who called, as they reported only having 5 children when there was actually 7, but only 5 went in the bank. And the bank tellers were obviously confused because the father had a different state ID than the mother, thinking that these weren't parents of all the same children. So as soon as the parents get home, there's police and whatever child protective services are called in Kentucky at that residence. And, they make all these demands of the parents. We need to interview your children. Apparently, they had to get consent to, ask the children to strip shirts, bruises. The parents consented with the male children, but not the female children, and no bruises were found. There's also the issue that, if it seems that people at the bank called, they said the children had bruises, but the children were all wearing, long sleeves and stuff like that. So how could, they possibly see bruises? Also, I grew up in a house with just one brother. We always had bruises on each other. I'm sure if you have 7 children, your children have several bruises, and that's just the way play and fun is, with young siblings. So there was absolutely no reason for the people at the bank to contact the police. And I think the important lesson in this whole story is that we have to stop helping the state inform on each other, especially these social distancing rules, and understand that people who maybe don't see all the stuff going on behind the scenes for everyone else, and so to not understand why they're not taking the same precautions that you. And I think in a lot of cases, if people don't report these kind of violations to the state, then it's pretty hard to enforce, these kind of laws. Now, and don't be absurd about it. I'm not saying that if you see somebody murder somebody else, don't work with the police on that. That's a completely different situation, but nonviolent crimes don't. All right, so the next story I have is an update on the whole Russiagate saga, and former National Security Advisor, Trump's first National Security Advisor, Michael Flynn, who ends up pleading guilty to lying to the FBI, although now he's not so happy about making that plea. So I think Flynn was probably the first indictment with this whole Russiagate saga. And he's, again, lying to the FBI, not in any way conspiring with Russia, which was the initial way especially left-wing mainstream media and really any Russiagate conspiracy theorists portrayed what happened with Flynn here. Now, he did have a call with the Russian ambassador that he was not forthcoming about to Vice President Mike Pence, but that call was on behalf of Israel, not Donald Trump, and had nothing to do with a conspiracy, again, between Trump and Vladimir Putin. And in fact, the Russians rejected what Flynn had asked them to do. So now it turns out that at least in some internal FBI communications about, what the whole objective is in the Flynn investigation, they actually look at just trying to trip Flynn up into lying to the FBI, which is essentially what happens here. Now, I know there is some other shady business going on where Flynn operated a company that provided lobbying and assessments and reports and stuff like that to foreign governments. And so it does seem that group took money, I believe, from Turkey and produced reports without registering as a foreign agent. But that isn't ultimately what gets Flynn either. So, these communications, if they're true, are pretty big, especially when you look into the personality conflict here a little bit with who was at the FBI, especially Andrew McCabe, who had a long-standing dispute with Flynn dating back to 2014 when I think Flynn was actually testifying against McCabe. Over at the UN, there is some positive things going on, trying to move towards a global ceasefire. While I don't put a whole lot of faith in the UN and don't like governments or world governments, kind of the worst kind, but at the same time, if the current political situation we find ourselves in means that if there is a global ceasefire to be carried out, it's likely to happen through the UN. And so the U.S. should get on board with this. I know the U.S. and Russia are the two members of the Security Council right now, kind of dragging their feet, saying we don't want to go along with it. We want to be continue certain of our military operations. So we need both of those countries to change direction, but progress with this could mean at least dialing down the violence in some countries, which is critical during the coronavirus outbreak. I also think it's a part of a larger conversation to just have where do we want to have our government spending so much money on military? And, this goes towards worldwide. We have $1.9 trillion spent on military worldwide in 2019. And now that we're facing an epidemic, or pandemic, it's a very relevant time to have the conversation. Do we really want to spend all this money fighting each other when, nature could be very deadly sometimes, and we could be pouring this money either into the private sector to, just be innovative and improve the lives of everyone in general. That way we're wealthier, more able to respond to the coronavirus, or at the very least, not using the money as essentially corporate welfare to the weapons makers and the executives of those countries, and put the money into something that helps Americans here at home. Although, again, I'm more a favor of the free market solution there. Russia issued a warning to the United States about low-yield nuclear weapons. They say if the United States uses one of those low-yield nukes, the Russians will respond with a full response, essentially saying that we're going to treat it like it's a regular nuclear weapon. So the U.S. over the past couple of years, especially during the Trump administration, has been working towards developing and now deploying low-yield nuclear weapons. these are nukes that are far smaller than the, city-killing hydrogen bombs that the U.S. has a lot of deployed and are very problematic. But there's an idea that these nuclear weapons could be used like tactically on a battlefield to take out, a division of soldiers or something like this. And there's an idea that in nuclear theory that it's called escalate to de-escalate. And essentially, if you use a low-yield nuclear weapon, the other side will see that you're willing to use nukes and won't respond with using nukes of their own. Of course, this is, I think, fairly absurd, and to place any kind of bets on other countries not using a nuclear weapon in response to your nuclear weapon just because it was kind of small, it's extremely reckless, as losing that bet is global nuclear holocaust. Russia put out a statement saying that more work needs to be done before more high-level talks can be had in resolving the Ukraine crisis. This is the, ongoing split from the civil war, loosely held together by a Minsk II ceasefire deal. Russia, Germany, France, and Ukraine are all parties to talks, and hoping that at some point this will get the situation now just in the Donbass of the country resolved, and that the people there could go about living much less hostile and dangerous lives. Ukraine also said they're very far away from completing the full transfer of prisoners of war in the conflict, and so it seems that there's a lot more diplomacy that needs to be done. This is one, I think, really problematic part of the coronavirus, and how probably smartly in most situations, there's now a whole lot of international travel going on. Unfortunately, we're still sending our aircraft carriers and destroyers on missions overseas and stuff like that. But diplomatic means are probably less likely to happen. Now, fortunately, this is 2020, and there's all these great technologies to allow, even high-level secure talks to happen from very far away remotely. But I think a lot of these talks happen because leaders like the fanfare and flash and headlines that come with having a summit. And you're certainly not going to get those photo ops on a Zoom call. The outgoing UN human rights envoy to Myanmar expresses concern that there's ongoing war crimes being committed by the country's army against minority groups in 2 regions of the country. This includes the Rohingya, a Muslim minority in the country who were already the subject of an ethnic cleansing campaign in late summer of 2017, where hundreds of thousands of them were forced out of the country and thousands killed in well-documented war crimes at this point. So if that is still going on, and again, those refugee camps now in Bangladesh of the Rohingya refugees are very densely crowded, and there's already like sanitation problems and flooding problems there. Likely could be a nightmare when coronavirus, if and when it makes it to those camps. All right, Gareth Porter has an amazing article out at The Gray Zone, reprinted over at antiwar.com, about how Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu released a bunch of fake documents at the end of April 2018 to help push the U.S. towards taking a more hawkish position with Iran, and has been a major part of the general Trump escalation of tensions with Iran that have led us to this maximum pressure campaign, the U.S. leaving the Iran nuclear deal, the assassination of Soleimani, missile attacks that caused traumatic brain injuries in over 100 U.S. soldiers. All these consequences of that ongoing round of tensions only increased by these fake documents. Now, if you're interested in all the details, Gareth goes through and explains how he knows everything and how he knows these are fakes, including the likely fabricated Israeli story of a highly specified and secret raid to obtain these nuclear documents. He explains that some of the diagrams and the images that are in the documents show that this isn't even the technology that Iran was working on, and so they have to be fabrications. And then the documents lack any kind of seal or any official representation to say that that these are Iranian documents. The other problem is that Israel won't give the original documents to anyone. Now, the date of the release of these documents is very important, April 30th, 2018. So this is before the U.S. ends up leaving the Iran nuclear deal. Now, maybe Trump has made up at that point because he would leave the next month, but if this was involved in pushing Iran or the Trump towards leaving the Iran nuclear deal, That's been absolutely disastrous policy, and it's important for Americans to understand how much influence Israel has on the U.S. Middle East policy, especially the policy towards Iran, the Palestinians, and Syria. On the last show, I talked about the new scheme Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Trump were cooking up to try to kill the Iran nuclear deal, where they're claiming that the U.S. is now a participant member, even though they've completely violated the deal and withdrawn from it. Again, back in May of 2018, they've reimposed sanctions on Iran that have been extremely detrimental. But now they want to claim that they've been part of it the whole time. And Pompeo is saying that we're going to make sure that the arms embargo that was supposed to be lifted on Iran, I believe, 5 or 6 years after the JCPOA went into effect, so that was 2015. He's saying there's no way we're going to allow Iran to buy arms. Now, it seems that once that arms embargo expires, the kind of UN and official channels will now allow Iran to buy weapons. And what steps will the U.S. take to enforce this unilateral embargo against Iran will be interesting to see, and could be very dangerous and escalate tension. The U.S. and several other countries, not just Iran, but Russia and China, could be supplying weapons to Iran. Germany banned Hezbollah, which is a militant and political group in Lebanon. They hold the Speaker of the Parliament there. They are, I think, the main representative party of the Lebanese Shia. And while at a time they did use terrorist tactics like, suicide bombings and stuff like that against the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon, really since that occupation has ended, this group has acted pretty close to military. This is a step that other countries have taken, including the United States and Israel, and I believe Japan. One of the problems with this is a further destruction of diplomacy between the United States and our general allies in the Middle East, like Israel and Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and groups like Hezbollah or Syria or Iran or the Houthis, who, those 4 groups aren't like in some unified alliance against the U.S., but, as we destroy the diplomacy between the West and the U.S. and those countries, it's more likely to lead to conflict and misunderstanding. The U.S. envoy to Syria, this is James Jeffrey, and I've talked about him a lot on the show, and he's a hawk, says that he wants Turkey to keep up the pressure on Tahrir al-Sham. This is HTS, the main al-Qaeda affiliate, left as a major stronghold against Assad in Syria. This is in the Idlib province that borders Turkey. Turkey has been the main benefactor of HTS for some time now, as the U.S. and other Gulf Arab allied countries withdrew their support as it was more and more clear Assad was going to win the civil war. One of the impacts of supporting the resistance to Assad in this civil war is it essentially created a al-Qaeda or terrorist safe haven in the Idlib province of Syria. And so this is something that the U.S. has become concerned about. And while Turkey has continued to support these, it now seems the U.S. wants Turkey to end that and, take out all these terrorists and people who, may actually want to do Americans harm. Yemen reports multiple deaths of coronavirus for the first time. Very disturbing news. Again, even if you don't think coronavirus is very serious, if you're like, hey, it's just a bad case of the flu, people die of bad cases of the flu in Yemen. That's what is going on with the cholera outbreak there. So expect this, I think, to be a major problem for Yemen in the months to come. Hopefully, maybe there's some kind of environmental factors that help to keep, the spread of the virus, or some kind of cultural traditions that maybe help. But it does seem like in a country with a depleted medical system and just overall infrastructure like Yemen, it's a place where the virus could really thrive. All right, last up for the week, and I'm going to get to this more on Monday when I talk to Will Porter. But Libya, we've seen quite a bit of movement as the Government and National Accord, which is the UN recognized government of Libya, although I think right now its just main backer is Turkey, has won several important battles around the capital of Tripoli and pushed the Libyan National Army, which is backed by countries like France, the UAE, and Russia, Egypt as well. Those have been some major setbacks. And so now you have the LNA calling for a ceasefire, and it'll be interesting to see if the GNA responds or if they will continue to press their advantage. But violence is brewing in Libya. And of course, we all just need to remember back to the Obama administration when we decided to overthrow the longtime leader there, Muammar Gaddafi, and create this ongoing, 8-9 year now civil war. All right, everybody, make sure you share the show, Libertarian Institute, at KYAAALE on Twitter. There's a private Facebook group called Foreign Policy Focus, so you could join that. Donate to the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.